Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Tactical video, we're going to be continuing right where we left off regarding the Xbox One's architecture. Now, the Xbox One's architecture, of course, has been fairly controversial, and the team, which would be Nick Baker and Andrew Gossen, have been obviously conducting a series of interviews. Some of this is going to be somewhat old ground, but they've also added a few bits to it as well. So we're going to discuss this quite in depth, and obviously as I'm going along I'm going to be giving my analysis, and once we've finished this series in terms of what they've got to say, I'm going to go with my own findings because I've been doing some research on this, and I'm also going to be discussing what developers have been saying as well, and then we'll be able to make some better decisions, I think. But anyway, enough frivolity, let's get on with things. So, basically, we're just going to start right out. He says, just like our friends were based on the Sea Island family, we made quite a number of changes in different parts of the areas. The biggest thing in terms of the number of compute units, and that's something that have been really easy to focus on. It's like, hey, let's count up the number of CUs, count up the gigaflops, and declare the winner based upon that. My take on it is that if you buy a graphics card, do you go by the specs or do you actually go run some benchmarks? Firstly, though, we don't have any games out. You can't see the games. And when you see the games, you'll be saying what the performance difference is between them. The games are the benchmarks. We've had the opportunity with the Xbox One to go and check a lot of our balance. The balance is the real key to making the game's performance on a game's console. You don't want one of the bottlenecks being the main bottleneck that slows you down. End quote. Right, I'm going to tackle this instantly. I've got some... Let's give some information on that. Now, the Sea Island family... for those who don't know, let's just demystify it straight off the bat. The Sea Island family is nothing special. It's exactly the same type of GPU that's inside the PlayStation 4, and to put it mildly, it's pretty much based on the Radeon 7000 architecture. The Radeon 7000 architecture was then rebadged for the Radeon 8000, but that's not buyable. You can't buy it basically if you're just you and I walking into the store, because it's a rebadge, and that's pretty much used for either laptops or desktops that have been put together by a company, say Dell, right? So it's an OEM. It's an OEM only product. In other words, AMD will only sell it to OEMs. Then you've also got a very similar architecture, pretty much identical, on the Radeon R9 280X. For example, there are other cards in exactly the same family which run on pretty much the Sea Island. So they're all utilizing pretty much the same GPU. Now, the point that he's trying to make here is that you can't just look at a compute unit. You can't just say, well, okay, we're just going to do this, this, and this, and that's it. The problem is, he has got some points. Now, here's the thing. One of them is that it comes down to what's the rest of the system that's feeding it. And we are going to talk a lot about the CPU side and some other bits on the Xbox One in a moment. But you're talking about the benchmarks, right? And if you're going to buy a graphics card, you look at the specs. Well, first of all, yes, I personally do. Because, well, it just makes sense to. Now, can there be things that artificially hamper that GPU? Yes, of course there could be things that artificially hamper it. Crap drivers, for example. There have been numerous incidents where GPUs have to be actually re-benchmarked. Because it turns out that either AMD or NVIDIA rushed the GPU out and the drivers just weren't mature enough, and so they re-benchmarked them, or, as in other cases, they actually had to give official reviews after their preview reviews, because the preview reviews were using, say, driver revision 10.1, and the actual real versions might have been 10.2. And although it might sound like a very incremental number, like, oh wow, who cares about like a 0.1, in reality there's actually huge differences, that it could improve the performance by like 20%, 25%, maybe more, especially in the early days of anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering, for example, which obviously are pretty much commonplace now. The other problem is we don't have access to the games. Andrew and Nick are completely right on that. I don't have an Xbox One sitting on my desk. And here's the problem though, developers do. And no matter what way people slice it, games developers have already said that the PS4's GPU is significantly more powerful. Now, there are numerous reasons as to why this is, but effectively it's just the amount of data it can process. There are other parts to it as well, such as the amount of ROPS, such as data being fed to it. Now, that is not the end of the story, because there are much more to a console than just the raw GPU performance. We all know this. It also has to do with the drivers. It has to do with how powerful the CPU is. It has to do with how good the performance of the memory is. It has to do with things such as programming talent. It has to do with so many different features, even how well it's debugged. But the reality is, right now, it looks like the Xbox One's GPU just simply can't keep up. And let's continue just for a moment. Balance is so key to real effective performance. It's been real nice on the Xbox One with Nick and his team, the system design folks who have built the system, where we've had the opportunity to go and check the balance of the systems and make tweaks accordingly. Did we do a good job when we did all of our analysis and simulations a couple of years ago? And guessing where the games would be in terms of utilization, I'll go into that in a moment. Did we make the right balance decisions back then? So raising the GPU clock as a result of that, of going in and tweaking our balance. We knew we had the headroom. What we didn't know was what we wanted to do with it until we had real titles to test it on, how much to increase the GPU by, or the CPU. We had the headroom. It's glorious having a console launch. Normally you have to go in and downclock. What we had a lifetime opportunity to go in and pick up the spots where we wanted to improve the performance, and it was great to have launch titles where you could actually have an informed decision on performance improvements you could get out of the headroom. Now, this part is quite crucial. Every Xbox One dev kit actually has 14 CUs on the silicon. Out of quote for a second. CUs are compute units. The proper Xbox One that you and I can buy, just to clarify, has 12. So, continuing, 2 of those CUs are reserved for redundancy in manufacturing. So what we could go in and do is experiment. If we actually have 14 CUs, so in other words, he's saying in a scenario where in reality, let's assume there was 14 compute units rather than just the 12, which would give you significantly more stream processors. 896 versus 768. By the way, if you want to know how many shaders that's going to be, all you have to do is the following math. Take the number of compute units, so in this case, say 12, and then you simply times it by 64 because each cluster of each compute unit has 64 stream processors within it, so that will give you the total number of shaders slash compute stream processors. So that's all you have to do. So once again, just take the number of compute units and times it by 64. Very easy math indeed. And that will of course work for the PlayStation 4, which has 18, which gives you like 1152, I think. Anyway, moving on. So what he's basically saying right here is that, oh wait, actually I haven't completely finished. If we were to actually have 14 CUs, what kind of performance benefit would we get versus 12? And if we were to raise the GPU clock, what sort of performance advantage would we get? And we actually saw the launch titles. We actually looked at a lot of launch titles in depth, and we found that we're going to 14 CUs was not as effective as the 6.6% clock upgrade that we did. So let's talk about this for a moment, because it's a pretty... This is one of the main fundamental arguments that a lot of people have had. And there was actually multiple points that have been raised. Firstly, what he's basically saying is that there are 2 CUs that are completely disabled, and they are for the purposes of redundancy. In other words, just in case that they get crappy yields. This will improve the yields, right? Now, let's go with the upclock first. So it's very good that they actually had the room to do that, but how much do you want to increase the CPU by, and how much do you want to increase the GPU by? He asks. That's Nick Baker. And here's my argument to that. As much as you bloody well can. It's just an obvious point. Now, that might sound a bit contrived, that might sound a bit harsh, that might not sound very professional to say that, but it's just true. There are obviously constraints. For example, let's assume that in the magical fantasy land of Disney and Pixies, that you can increase it by an exponential amount. That doesn't happen, does it? Reality is that you obviously have certain power levels that you can go to. In other words, how much energy you want the chips to use, how much heat you want them to use, what chance do you actually think that if you push them up to, how much do you actually think you can increase it by without affecting your yields? So in other words, let's assume that you would increase it from 800 to 850, which is basically what they did. How many chips would that mean that would not make the grade? So let's say you've got 1,000 chips. Would that mean, rather than, let's just make up a numbers, let's say rather than having 50 units that are not going to be able to make the speed of 800 megahertz, you're now going to have 60 units which aren't going to make the speed of 850 megahertz, right? Just for example. And so you're always going to increase that speed by as much as you bloody well can. However, obviously Microsoft cannot legislate. They cannot tell you, well, you can't have a cat sitting on top of your Xbox One, because, well, realistically that's just not going to happen. You can't ever legislate what people do with the systems. In other words, you can't protect it from abuse, and that's why they do have things such as thermal throttling. But the big area of, let's say, debate, because I think that's the polite way to put it, is the compute units. There's two sides of the coin here. The first is that compute units don't scale linearly. In other words, it is not necessarily true that if you have 10 compute units and someone else has 20 compute units, you're going to be precisely, half their speed. In other words, the 20 are going to be exactly twice what you are. And so the argument is that, basically speaking, now if you actually do the maths on the various configurations, the three configurations that, let's say, are posited here that are, could be used, there could be the original configuration of the Xbox One, which was 1.22 T-flops, and that was 14 compute units at 800 megahertz. The next one, which gives you 1.32 T-flops, and that's the current configuration. That's 12 compute units, and that's running at 853 megahertz. At 1.43 T-flops, that's 14 compute units at 800 megahertz. So you can see that basically I'm rounding up the figures, there is slight discrepancy. It's actually slightly higher than this for each of them, but it's just over 100 flops, not T-flops, 100 flops better. In theory, if you just look at the raw numbers from 12 to 14 at 800 megahertz, for the 14 versus 12 at 853. So in other words, it's an improvement. It is faster to actually have 14 if you just look at the raw numbers. But there's some arguments as to the reason not. Now, one of them is Microsoft is saying it does not scale linearly. Now, this is a huge topic, and I will go back to it because I don't want to divert this whole rest of the interview to this. But from my findings, it's not 100% linear scale. In other words, it's not one-to-one, but it's a lot better than what Microsoft are letting on. But I have a feeling that they decided to go with the higher clock speeds because of a different reason. Because it actually improves, for example, the speed of the ES RAM, which of course is, well, let's just go with vital for the Xbox One's performance. In fact, I'm going to read a little bit more of the quote. Everybody knows from the internet it's going to be 14 CUs should give you almost 17% more performance. This is what you get when you're reading tons of numbers right now. I've got so many bloody notes open. But in terms of actual measured games, what actually ultimately counts is better for engineering decision to raise the clocks. There are various bottlenecks you have in the pipeline that can cause you not to get the performance you want when design is out of balance. Increasing frequency impacts the whole GPU, whereas adding CUs beefs up the shaders and the ALU. Right, by fixing the clock, not only do we increase our ALU performance, I'm just going to give a quick note on what ALU actually is. It's basically raw computational power, right? That's all ALU is. I'm pretty sure most of you probably know that, but I'll just throw it in there just in case you're curious. We also, back in quote, we also increase the vertex rate, we increase our pixel rate, we ironically increase our ESRAM bandwidth, continues, and this is from Gossen. But we also increase the performance in areas surrounding the bottlenecks, like draw calls floating through the pipeline, the performance of reading GPRs out of the GPR pool. The GPU is giantly complex. There's gazillions of areas in the pipeline that can be your bottleneck, in addition to just ALU and fetch performance. So this part I want to tackle. Just to clarify, by the way, GPRs are general purpose registers, which are pretty much very small areas of memory. So just hopefully you guys are aware of that. So what they're basically saying, pretty simple. They're basically, you could read between the lines. For them, for example, there's issues such as them not having as many ROPs, raster operators, and all of those, of course, are extremely important for scene drawing. They've got exactly half the amount of the PlayStation 4. Arguably, 16 should be sufficient for 1080p. But when you start getting nasty little things such as anti-aliasing, I'm teasing. Anti-aliasing, of course, is very good, but it's not very good for performance. Some levels of the more complicated AA can really start to play havoc with your performance. And yeah, so all they're basically saying, of course, with the pixel fill rate and so on, vertex fill rate, this means ultimately that you have a far higher fill rate that not necessarily equals to the most important thing. It's providing you've got high enough fill rate to basically draw the scene, you're generally okay. But there's still going to come a time when you're going to want that fill rate, and I guess we're just going to have to see exactly how this goes, because with the Xbox One, increasing their clock speed did help with this quite a bit. It increases the performance of the ROPs, for example. It increases the ESRAM bandwidth, which is, well, very important for them, because let's put it this way, that's what's providing enough bandwidth to actually feed the GPU, because the DDR3 is not going to be sufficient. It's just not enough memory bandwidth in it at all to do that. Now, back in the day, the PlayStation 4 didn't actually have 18 CUs, it actually had 14, with 4 extras that were supposedly allocated towards compute. And so Andrew Gossen pointed this out. He said he was talking about the leaked documents, or the documents that have been kind of circulated, the early versions of the Orbis when it was known as that, and he said Sony were actually agreeing with us. They said that their system was balanced for 14 CUs. They used that term, balance. Balance is so important. In terms of the actual efficient design, their additional 4 CUs were very beneficial for the additional GPU work. We've actually taken a very different tact from that. The experiments we did, that we had headroom on the CUs as well in terms of balance, we did index more in terms of the CUs than needed, so we have CU overhead. There is room in our title to grow over time in terms of CU utilization. Exemplar ironically doesn't need much ALU. It's much more about the latency you have in terms of memory fetch. So this is kind of a natural evolution to us. It's like, okay, it's the memory system which is more important for some particular GP and GPU workloads. So first things first, this is out of quote, they're not discussing and talking about the GDDR5 memory bandwidth here. Or, indeed, they are not talking about the fact that there's this, like, I don't know, myth that seems to be whirling around the internet for some reason. The GDR5 has this massive amount of memory bandwidth. They think it's like a cruise liner trying to stop on a dime in terms of bandwidth, in terms of latency, and it's actually not. I've really gone into this in another video and even an article on RGT, so you can type in DDR3 versus GDR5 latency and stuff on the channel if you so wish. You could see that, but suffice to say, in terms of nanoseconds, just because of how speedy the memory is, in terms of cycles, in terms of how it fetches data and sends data and reads and writes data, it's pretty much identical. So they're not talking about that. Instead, they're actually talking about the memory paths inside the system. And the gist of it, and I will go back into this later on, but the argument is that the coherent memory bandwidth between the PlayStation 4, between the PlayStation 4's CPU and GPU is actually less than the Xbox One, from what we understand from leaked documents. But as I said, that's quite a big topic, and I want to go through as much of the interview as possible, and then I want to start breaking it down with some real in-depth analysis and actually start tackling some of this. And there'll probably be some articles as well once I've gone into that, because I want to do some diagrams and stuff as well. But anyway, interestingly, the biggest source for your frame rate drops actually comes from the CPU, not the GPU. Adding the margin on the CPU, we actually had titles that were losing frames largely because the CPU bound in terms of the core threads. In providing what looks like a very little boost, we actually got a significant win for us, making sure that we got a steady frame rate across our consoles. We've got a lot of CPU offload going on. We've got shape. We've got a more efficient command processor relative to the standard design. And we've got a clock boost in large part, particularly to ensure that we've got headroom for the frame rates. And he added an example. Imagine you've got a rendered depth buffer in the ES RAM. And now you're switching to another depth buffer. You may want to go out and pull what is now a texture into DDR, so that you can texture it out later, and you're not going to do tons of reads from that texture, so it actually makes sense to do it from DDR. You can use the move engine to move these things asynchronously in concert with the GPU, so the GPU isn't spending any of the time on the move. You've got a DMA, direct memory access, engine doing it. Now the GPU can go on and immediately work on the next render target rather than having to move bits around. End quote for a moment. I actually really do like the move engines. They're pretty much essential in some ways because of the DDR3/ES RAM. But the fact they are there, I really, really do like them. I've been fairly vocal on my love for the move engines. I've spoken about them before, but they're basically fixed function processors which move basically data around. So their job is to pretty much shunt data from one memory address to another memory address. So it could basically say, okay, well, you need to be to this part of the memory, or you need to be moving to the CPU, or you need to be using to the GPU. And this helps not only offload data from the GPU, in other words, it takes the workload off of the GPU, but it also does the same thing for the CPU. They're pretty lightweight, and they don't really require any work from the perspective of developers as far as what we understand, because they're pretty much fixed function. So in other words, you don't have to code specifically. What you have to do is initially set up where you need the memory to go, and the move engines will take care of it, which is pretty nice. Shape, of course, is their audio processor, and it's quite important actually, because I'm actually very curious on the PS4 how much the CPU is going to hold things back. We're not sure yet. There have been murmurings that the PS4's CPU is going to be the thing that developers are going to lament this generation. There are good examples that already the developers are needing to go very wide, but that's understandable and that's accepted. It's only 150 megahertz. Now, we are making a couple of assumptions. The first assumption is this PS4 is not going to get an upclock, which has not been confirmed, and so, who gives a crap? But, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the PS4 runs at 1.6. Sony haven't confirmed anything. You know what? If it was faster than the Xbox Ones, I've got a feeling Sony would confirm it. That's just my own gut feeling. Sony, I'm not hating on either company, but Sony aren't good when it comes to just admitting when one of their specs aren't as good as the Xbox or their rival. I mean, this was classic back on the days of the PlayStation 2 and the PS3, but the PS3 and the Xbox 360 era was ridiculous with the amount of name calling anyway. I mean, it was really bad. It was quite ludicrous. Both sides refusing to kind of give in. I mean, the PS2, for example, with the Emotion Engine, how they were arguing it's going to be Toy Story level graphics and stuff like that. It's just bad. So I personally think it's going to be 1.6. It's not been confirmed. So I think that Microsoft are possibly going to have the CPU advantage. Arguably, the PlayStation 4 can shift things off, however, to the GPU in terms of compute. And from what I'm understanding, the GPU is probably going to be a little bit more powerful for compute, not only because of the extra CUs involved, but also for another reason, that they've got a very advanced queue system for issuing compute commands, and also just the general architecture. For example, the volatile bit, which can be a big deal. I mean, just the option for the PlayStation 4 to be able to nuke specifically lines of code inside the level 2 cache, which is basically what volatile bit is. Imagine, for example, you've got 100 lines and you don't want to necessarily delete all the 100 because there's only like 3 that are even anything to do with what you want to delete. So let's assume all you want to go in there is make a surgery strike against line 51, and all the other lines are your best friends. You need to keep them exactly as is. You don't want to then put strain on that system by effectively asking it to fill back up the level 2 cache because you just nuked it all, and that's what volatile bit does. As far as I understand it from what I'm reading, Sony have volatile bit and Microsoft does not have anything similar. Sony were the ones who called it volatile bit, so if Microsoft call it something, it might be called something a little bit different, but we're not really sure right now. Anyway, I'm just going to round this up because there's not too much of the interview remaining. We've done things on the GPU side as well with our hardware overlays to ensure more consistent frame rates. We have 2 independent layers we can give to the titles, where it could be 3D content and one could be the HUD. We have high quality scaler than we had in the Xbox 360. It allows you to quickly change the scalar parameters on a frame by frame basis, and I talked to the CPU glitches causing frame glitches. The GPU workloads tend to be a lot more coherent frame to frame. There doesn't tend to be a big spike once you get the CPU, and so you can adapt to that. And we're seeing titles is adopting the notion of dynamic resolution scaling to avoid glitching frame rates. As soon as they start getting into the idea, we're starting to hit on a margin where they could potentially go over the frame budget. They could start dynamically scaling back on resolution, so they could keep their HUD in terms of true resolution. The 3D content is squeezing. Again, from my aspect as a gamer, I'd rather have a consistent frame rate and more squeezing of the number of pixels than frame rate glitches. And from a power efficiency standpoint as well, fixed functions are more power friendly on fixed function units. We put a data compression on there as well, so we have level 2 compression, decompression, and also motion JPEG decode, which helps with connect. So there's a lot more to the data move engines, moving one block of memory to the other. Anyway, that's the end of the interview, but I'm going to give my final thoughts on this, this part anyway, because obviously I've got at least a lot of analysis to do after this. But I'm just going to quickly explain that. All they're basically talking about is that every resolution, every frame of animation, let's say let's just make it easy, and let's assume that the game's target frame rate is 30 frames per second. So that means every second there's got to be 30 individual frames of animation that have been created. Let's further assume that a scene becomes extraordinarily complicated. Let's assume that the target resolution is 1080p, and the game starts noticing, crap, I'm running slower than what I should be. I'm only getting like 22 frames a second. What it could basically do is, if it notices it's taking too long to draw on a frame-by-frame basis, it will dynamically reduce the resolution. So for example, rather than being 1080p, it could be 900p for a certain frame, and then it would automatically scale that to a full resolution. I admit Sony and Microsoft are getting hit on the head because a lot of their titles aren't 1080p. The reality is, that's not really a surprise. None of the next generation consoles in the end are going to be 1080p for all of their games, because it's just not realistic because of just how much extra work it puts on the GPU. I've given this math before, but if you don't believe me, times 1920 by 1080 and then look at the number, and then times I don't know, let's say 1600 by 900, which is 900p. And then look at the numbers and compare them, and that's how much extra work the GPU is doing in terms of pixels. Anyway, in terms of the HUD, however, that would still be native and true 1080p. It would only be the background scenes that would be the thing scaling. So let's assume you're playing something like Street Fighter. The life bars and so on would remain in 1080p. However, the characters might dynamically shift up and down, and it would obviously, you personally wouldn't notice anything. You would just notice maybe the frame rate, the quality may drop for a couple of frames if you were to, say, pause it and play it back frame by frame by frame. But however, for the most part, it probably wouldn't be super noticeable unless it starts to really drag under. Anyway, that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I'll see you soon. There will be, of course, more parts to this one. I'm going to start to actually properly challenge this, and I'm going to start to give a lot more information in terms of coherent bandwidth and stuff, and I'm actually going to properly start comparing it to the PS4. So hopefully you've enjoyed this getting through the interview part. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.